She grabbed the blanket I spent 4 months knitting with my crippled arthritic hands, called it cheap, and dropped it in the trash. She had no idea what my dead husband sewed inside it. She held it up by 2 corners, the way you'd hold something you suspected was dirty. My daughter-in-law Natalie, 20 people watching. Her friend Brooke's phone rolling, tilted at just the right angle to catch the moment. Natalie's nose wrinkled, and she let one corner of her mouth hole up, and she said, with the casual cruelty of someone who has never once considered how a word lands, "We only use designer things here." Then she dropped my blanket in the trash. The room didn't go silent. That's what surprised me. A few women laughed, nervous, embarrassed laughter, the kind people make when they want to signal they're not the one being humiliated. Natalie's mother Beverly said, "Bless her heart," just loud enough to be heard. Someone changed the subject. The room lurched back into motion, music and ribbon and a basket of designer onesies wrapped in cellophane. My son Ethan stood against the far wall with his drink in his hand and his face the color of old chalk. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at me, and then he looked at the floor, and then very slowly he looked somewhere else entirely. He said nothing. I walked to the trash can. I lifted my blanket out. I folded it the way you fold something that matters. Corners first, then thirds, then tucked. I put it under my arm. I said goodbye to the women near the door, because that's what you do, because I had been raised to be gracious in the moments that tested you hardest. And then I walked out into the February afternoon and sat in my car and held Gerald's blanket against my chest and said quietly to no one, "I'm sorry." But underneath the grief, underneath the humiliation, something went very still, the way deep water calms. Suddenly I could see all the way to the bottom. Nobody in that room had any idea what they had almost just watched disappear. My name is Darlene Marsh. I am 68 years old. I have rheumatoid arthritis in both hands, diagnosed 11 years ago, severe in the right for the last 5. My fingers don't close the way they used to. Some mornings I spend 40 minutes before I can hold a coffee mug without shaking. I have adapted. I have learned to do almost everything I used to do, just slower and with more pain than I let on, because I was raised by people who didn't mention pain at the dinner table. I want you to understand what 4 months of knitting costs a woman with hands like mine, not in time I had. My husband Gerald had been dead for 10 months when I started that blanket, and the house in Crawfordsville, Indiana that we had shared for 38 years was large and quiet in a way that rang like a bell that never stopped. I had time. What the knitting cost me was the daily decision to keep going. Every row was a conversation with pain that I had to win before I could move to the next one. My occupational therapist had advised against extended knitting projects. I told her I understood, and then I went home and kept going, because Gerald had asked me to make something, and I did not know how to let Gerald down even now that he was dead. I need to back up, because the blanket is not the beginning of this story. The beginning is a Tuesday in April 3 years ago, when Gerald's oncologist used the phrase, "no further treatment options," in a voice so practiced and gentle that it took me a full 30 seconds to understand what he had said. Gerald Marcus Marsh, 69 years old at the time of diagnosis, retired high school history teacher, 31 years, Chicago Cubs fan in the way only men who grew up in central Indiana become Cubs fans, with an almost philosophical acceptance of disappointment. He could build anything with his hands. He had a voice like a radiator coming on in an old house. He called me Dar, always, every day of our 43 years of marriage, the way some people say hello, reflexively, warmly, as if your name was the word they reached for first. The week before he died, when the hospital room had gone quiet, and the family visiting hours had thinned out, and it was just the 2 of us in the lamplight, Gerald asked me to get the old cigar box from the top shelf of his closet at home. He described exactly where it was. I had seen that box for 3 decades and never opened it because Gerald was a private man in certain specific ways, and I respected the shape of his privacy. I drove home and got it. Inside, savings bonds, rubber banded by year, going back 30 years. $50 here, $100 there, a $200 one from a year when his school district had given a longevity bonus, every birthday check from his mother before she passed, every small windfall he had ever quietly redirected. He had never mentioned them. In 30 years of shared finances, paying down the mortgage and raising Ethan and replacing the roof twice and getting through the winter Gerald's pension was docked, he had never dipped into that box. The envelope on top said, in his handwriting, "For our first grandbaby." I brought the box back to the hospital room and I sat down, and Gerald told me, with the deliberate clarity of a man who knows he has a limited number of sentences left and is not going to waste them, that the bonds had matured, that together they came to just under $50,000. 47,300 and some change, he said, and he almost smiled at the "and some change," the way he always smiled at precise numbers, like they were a private joke between him and the world. He told me not to hand it to them in an envelope. Money in an envelope gets spent, he said. Money you can see disappears. He had thought about this for a long time, the way Gerald thought about everything, slowly, without announcing it, and then with complete certainty. He said, "Sew it into something, make them find it, make it last." That was his request. Not a demand, not a directive. A request the way Gerald always asked for things, as if the person he was asking had a choice, because he genuinely believed they did. I sat with him for another 2 hours that night. He died on a Thursday, 4 days later, at 6:17 in the morning. I was holding his hand. I started the blanket in January, 4 months after we buried him. him. Cream wool from a shop in Indianapolis that I had been ordering from for 20 years. Blue sailboats along the border because Gerald had loved the water. We had taken a trip to the Lake Michigan shore every summer for the first 20 years of our marriage before Ethan's school schedule made it complicated, and Gerald had always stood at the water's edge longer than anyone else, just looking. In the lower right corner of the blanket, I stitched his initials, GM small, deliberate. The kind of thing you'd have to look for, but that would always be there once you knew. On the inside, along the bottom edge, I sewed a hidden pocket, 3 inches wide, sealed with 6 small hand stitches in a thread that matched the wool. Into that pocket, I folded the savings bonds, organized by year, still rubber banded the way Gerald had kept them. 30 years of small decisions that had added up to something real. And one more thing, a letter. Gerald had dictated it in the hospital, the week before he died, pausing for breath between sentences while I wrote in the small notebook I kept in my purse. A letter to a grandchild he had never held and would never hold. He addressed it simply, to you. It covered 3 pages. It talked about the Cubs and about Indiana in October, and about what he had learned in 31 years of teaching teenagers, and about the one summer when he was 22 that he almost did something different with his life. It ended, be curious about everything. Be kind when it costs you. You come from people who tried. Love, Grandpa Gerald. Sealed in a small envelope, written across the front in his handwriting, which I had practiced copying until I could do it cleanly, to be opened at 18. $47,000 and a dying man's last words. Sewn into something a young woman would stand up in a room full of people and call cheap. I had met Natalie Volpe, Natalie Marsh now, at the dinner Ethan arranged when they had been dating for about 6 months. She was 27 at the time, 3 years younger than Ethan, and she was the kind of attractive that she was clearly accustomed to being treated differently for. She worked in marketing for a small luxury brand out of Indianapolis. She had opinions about furniture and restaurants that she expressed as facts. She called my house when she first saw it so cozy, in a voice that meant something else. I am not going to tell you I disliked Natalie from the start. That would be too convenient, and it wouldn't be honest. What I felt was something more neutral, a kind of watchful uncertainty, the way you feel when you meet someone important to someone you love, and you're not sure yet whether they're going to be good for them. I watched how she talked to the server at the restaurant Ethan took us to. I watched how she handled disagreement, whether she could be contradicted without recalibrating the temperature of the room. I watched whether she ever asked Gerald a question, or whether she talked at him. The pattern, once I could see it, was consistent. Natalie was generous with people who could benefit her, and efficient with people who couldn't. Gerald was 67 and retired and had hearing aids and a laugh that came from somewhere low in his chest, and Natalie was efficient with him. Pleasant. Correct. She remembered his birthday because Ethan reminded her. She did not remember that he taught history, and she asked him once at Thanksgiving what subject he used to teach, despite having been told at least twice. It was a small thing. Most of what Natalie did was small things. The larger things came later. They always do. Ethan and Natalie got married in September, 2 years before Gerald died. Gerald walked with a cane by then, and Natalie had decided, with the quiet efficiency that characterized her major decisions, that the wedding aesthetic was modern botanical, which meant the centerpieces were specific and expensive, and the guest list was tightly curated. My sister Ruth was not invited. She and I had grown up together in this town. She had known Gerald since 1981. The reason Natalie gave was that the venue had a hard capacity. The venue held 220 people. There were 164 guests. I did not push it. I called Ruth and apologized, and Ruth said, in the way of a woman who has known me long enough to read between everything, I understand completely. I understood too. I was just learning what I was understanding. After the wedding, a pattern emerged. Natalie made decisions, small ones at first. What they served at the first Christmas they hosted, how long family visits should last, which of her friends would be included in holidays, and which of Ethan's would not. Ethan nodded along. He had always been a conflict-avoidant person. I had watched that in him since he was a teenager, the way he would smooth things over rather than stand his ground, how he mistook keeping the peace for making it. He was a gentle person. That gentleness, in Natalie's hands, had become something else. It had become compliance. Gerald noticed. He was not a man who said things before he was ready to say them, but in the last year of his life, when it was just the two of us in the evenings, and he was less careful with his words because he had fewer of them, he said once quietly, I worry about Ethan. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. I put my hand on his, and we sat in the lamplight, and we both knew what we were thinking. When the baby was announced, 6 months after Gerald died, 7 months into my grief, I felt 2 things simultaneously. I felt the real, uncomplicated joy of a grandmother who had waited a long time for this, and I felt something careful and attentive, the way you feel when something precious is about to be handled by someone whose grip you're not sure of. The baby shower was Natalie's mother Beverly's production, held at a venue in Carmel, Indiana, 40 minutes from Crawfordsville, in early February. Beverly Volpe is a woman who operates on the same frequency as her daughter, but at greater volume. She greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach above her cheekbones, and complimented my blouse in a way that implied she was being generous. The venue was decorated in soft sage and cream, balloon arches in the corners, a gift table near the window with a velvet runner. A friend of Natalie's named Brooke had positioned herself near the gift table from the start, phone ready. She had filmed the balloon arch being set up. She had filmed the cake arrival. She was, it became clear, the designated documentarian of the event. I set my my plain cream box on the gift table and found my seat. The women around me were Natalie's friends and Beverly's friends, with a few of Ethan's cousins mixed in, my side of the table really, though there was no assigned seating. I talked to Ethan's cousin Lena, who is 24 and kind, and had driven down from Fort Wayne. I talked to Gerald's sister Caroline, who was 71 and had bad knees, and had made the trip anyway because she had loved Gerald's whole life and was not about to miss the celebration of his first grandchild. Caroline is the one who knew about the blanket. I had told her in December, when I was 3 weeks from finishing it, sitting at her kitchen table with my tea and my aching hands. I had told her everything, the pocket, the bonds, the letter. She had put her hand over her mouth and cried. She had said, "Darlene, that's the most Gerald thing I've ever heard in my life." She was right. It was entirely Gerald. The gift opening started at 2 o'clock. Natalie sat in the sage green upholstered chair at the center of the room, and Brooke angled in from the side, and Beverly handed her gifts in an order that felt pre-planned. The first 5 were from Natalie's side: a designer diaper bag in buttery tan leather, a cashmere newborn set in ivory, a stroller with a name I didn't recognize that apparently retailed for $1,200, a wicker basket of organic skincare items from Beverly herself, and an embossed silver photo album. Each one was held up and appraised and set aside with visible satisfaction. Then Beverly handed Natalie the plain cream box. "Let's see what Grandma made," Natalie said. That corner of her mouth did something, just barely. The face of someone who has already decided what this is before she opens it. She lifted the blanket out and held it up by 2 corners, the way you'd hold something you weren't sure of. Her nose moved. Brooke's phone was rolling. The room was watching. "That's so sweet," Natalie said. "It's very homemade." Beverly laughed. Bless her heart. I sat with my hands folded in my lap. I am 68 years old with arthritic hands, and I had not flinched when the pain was at its worst, and I was not going to flinch now. Then Natalie stood up, still holding the blanket by 2 corners, and crossed to the trash can near the gift table, a decorative one, brushed gold, placed there for ribbon and wrapping, and held my blanket over it. "We only use designer things here," she said. "For the room, for Brooke's camera." She let go. Gerald's sailboats, his initials in the corner, his 30 years of savings bonds, his last letter to a grandchild he never held, the pocket I had stitched with hands that screamed at me every morning. In a trash can. The room made a sound, half laugh, half uncertainty. Someone started talking about the stroller. The event moved on. I stood up. I walked to the trash can. I lifted my blanket out. I folded it. Corners first, then thirds. The way you fold something that has weight. I tucked it under my arm. I said goodbye to Lena. I said goodbye to Caroline. Caroline looked at me with an expression I have never forgotten. Something between horror and absolute fury. Completely controlled. I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot and held the blanket and said quietly, "I'm sorry, Gerald." But the grief had a floor. I could feel it now. Solid and certain beneath everything else. I was 3 miles from home when my phone rang. Caroline. Her voice was tight in the way voices get when a person is choosing every word with care. "Darlene, I told Ethan. I told him what was inside the blanket." I said, "How much did you tell him?" "Everything." 3 minutes passed. Then Ethan called. "Mom," just 1 syllable, cracked straight through the middle. "I have the blanket," I said, before he could ask. "It's fine. Everything's fine." I heard him exhale like a man who had been holding his breath underwater. Then quietly, "What was inside it?" "The bonds. All of them. And the letter." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he made a sound I hadn't heard from my son since he was 11 years old and had fallen off his bicycle and come inside trying not to cry. Raw, gutted, the sound of someone finally understanding the weight of a thing. "I was right there," he said. "I watched it happen. And I laughed. Mom, I laughed. I let him sit with that. I did not absolve him. He needed to sit with it." "I'm sorry," he said. "I know. What do you want me to do?" "Whatever you say. I mean it. For once in my life, I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one." It was the most honest thing I had heard from my son in several years. It cracked something open that I hadn't realized had been closed. I thought for a moment. Then I said, "One thing. The whole family in one room. I want to give that baby his grandfather's gift properly. Out loud, where everyone can hear what it is, and where everyone can understand what almost happened to it." "Okay," Ethan said. "And Ethan, I need you to be there. Not against the wall. Present. Do you understand what I mean?" A pause. "Yeah," he said. "I do. We agreed on Sunday dinner, 1 week out. Ethan's house. He would call his cousins. Caroline would come. Beverly and Natalie would be there because it was a family dinner and because Ethan would invite them without explanation. In the week between, I made 2 phone calls that were not about dinner at all. The first was to my bank, where I had kept the bonds in a safe deposit box since Gerald died. I told them I needed to discuss the process for redeeming savings bonds on behalf of a minor and placing the proceeds in a custodial account. They connected me with an advisor named Dennis, who was patient and clear and very good at his job. We discussed the structure. We discussed what control looked like and what protection looked like, and how you could ensure that money given to a child actually reached the child. The second call was to a woman named Patricia Haynes, a family law attorney in Indianapolis, who had been recommended to me by a colleague of Gerald's. Patricia specialized in estate matters and had, over a phone call that lasted 55 minutes, a way of explaining legal frameworks that made them feel like common sense rather than foreign territory. She outlined a structure that would hold the funds in a custodial account under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. The funds would be managed by a trustee, me, and transferred to Ethan and Natalie's son at 18. Not before, not through, not accessible to anyone except the child. On Sunday afternoon, Patricia faxed me a 1-page 1-page document that I folded and placed in my coat pocket alongside the blanket. Sunday dinner was at 5. I arrived at 4:30 because I am always early, and because I wanted to see the room before it filled. Ethan's house was warm and smelled like the pot roast he'd spent the afternoon making. He hugged me at the door and held on a moment longer than usual. His eyes were red at the edges. He had not slept well. I could see Natalie in the kitchen, moving efficiently, her face carefully composed into the pleasant neutrality she wore for occasions that required management. She greeted me with a smile. "Darlene, so glad you could make it," as if I were a neighbor and not his mother, and as if the previous Sunday had not happened. I said, "Thank you for having me," and hung up my coat and sat down. The room filled over the next 30 minutes. Ethan's cousin Lena, two of Gerald's nephews, grown men now with their own children, Caroline, who had driven an hour with her bad knees without complaint. Beverly arrived with her husband Dale, who had the good grace to seem uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. Natalie's friend Brooke was not there. This was not, I understood, a social performance. This was family. Dinner was served and eaten. Ethan was quieter than usual. He refilled glasses and passed dishes and did not meet Natalie's eyes more than twice. The conversation moved the way dinner conversation moves. School, work, weather, the baby's due date, the name they had chosen. James Gerald Marsh. I had not known about the middle name. I had to set my fork down for a moment. After dessert, when Beverly was pushing her chair back to offer to help clear, Ethan said quietly, "Mom has something she'd like to share." The table stilled. I reached into my coat, which was folded over the back of my chair, and I drew out the blanket and set it on the table, still folded, the cream wool and the blue sailboats. Then I set the custodial account document beside it and the sealed envelope, and I laid my hands flat on the table because I wanted them to be still. "Gerald asked me to make something," I said. "I want to tell you what he put inside it." I told them, not quickly, not with drama, the way Gerald would have told it, with specifics and patience, because specifics are what make a thing real. The cigar box, 30 years of bonds, the number $47,312, the hidden pocket, the letter sealed for James to open at 18, GM in the corner, small enough to miss. I watched the room as I spoke. Ethan's cousins were still. Gerald's nephews had the expressions of men hearing something that mattered. Lena had her hand over her mouth. Caroline was watching Natalie. I watched Natalie too. She had gone very carefully still, the kind of still that is not peace. Her hands were in her lap and her face had done something complex. Cycling, very quickly, through expressions she was used to not showing. I had the sense of watching a calculation run and find no output. Beverly broke first. "Well," she said, and then stopped. "There's one more thing," I said. I unfolded the document Patricia had prepared. "The funds have been placed in a custodial account under James Gerald Marsh's name. They'll be held until he turns 18. I'm the account trustee." I slid the document to the center of the table. "This is the structure Gerald wanted. Money in an envelope gets forgotten. He didn't want it forgotten." Natalie's voice, when it came, was very controlled. "Why wouldn't you just give it to us to manage?" I looked at her. I did not look away. "Because of what I watched you do last Sunday." The room was completely quiet. "I carried your son's inheritance into that shower," I said. "Gerald's last gift. $47,000 and a letter he dictated in a hospital bed. You held it up, called it cheap, and put it in a trash can in front of 20 people and a camera." I kept my voice level. "You didn't know what was inside. I understand that. But I think you know what you meant to do, regardless of what was inside. And so do I." Natalie opened her mouth. Something crossed her face. Anger. And then the calculation running again. And then something almost like shame, though I couldn't be sure. "That isn't fair," she said. "It is," Ethan said. Just that. 2 words. No volume. No accusation. He said it the way a man says something when he has finally arrived at a truth and is done rerouting around it. Natalie turned to look at him. He met her eyes. Beverly started to speak. Ethan said gently, "Beverly, not tonight." Beverly subsided. "The account is set up," I said. "James gets it at 18. Between now and then, any questions go through Patricia Haynes in Indianapolis. Her number is on the document." I folded the document back and set it near the blanket. "And this is James's blanket. His grandfather's initials are in the bottom right corner. His grandfather's letter is sealed inside. I would like him to have it in his crib from the day he comes home." I slid the blanket across the table to Ethan. Ethan picked it up. He held it for a moment. He found the corner with the initials without being told where to look. Just ran his thumb along the border until he found it. The way you find things you know must be there. He pressed his thumb over the GM and kept it there. Then he said very quietly, "Thanks, Mom." The fallout was not immediate. These things never are. Natalie did not speak to me for 6 weeks. Beverly called Ethan twice in the following days to express, in her diplomatic way, that the dinner had been handled in a manner that was unnecessarily public and quite hurtful to Natalie, who has been under significant stress. Ethan listened both times. Both times he thanked her for calling and said he thought his mother had been right. Brooke posted the baby shower video. It circulated the way these things do. First among Natalie's friends, then, because someone shared it outside that circle, more broadly. I did not watch it. Several people told me it existed. Several people sent me messages that were various degrees of kind. An acquaintance I hadn't heard from in 10 years wrote to say she had seen it and was sorry. A woman I didn't know at all wrote a long message about her own experience with something similar and signed it with just her first name. I answered every one of them. Carolyn came for dinner 3 Sundays in a row after that. She brought potato soup the first time and nothing the second, and a bottle of wine the third. And we sat in Gerald's house in the evenings and talked about him the way you can only talk about someone when you've loved them long enough to include the complicated parts. We talked about what he would have made of all this. We agreed he would have been quiet about it for a long time. We agreed he would have been proud of the account. We agreed he would have told Ethan privately to pay better attention. James Gerald Marsh was born on April 9th, a Tuesday morning. 7 pounds, 11 ounces. Ethan called me from the hospital at 8:14 in the morning and said, "He's here, Mom. He looks like Dad around the eyes." I sat down on the kitchen chair and put my hand over my mouth. Natalie and I have found a way to be in the same rooms. It is not warm. I don't think it will become warm. What it is something more stable. A mutual recognition that we are both here, that James is here, and that certain things matter more than the ground we lost. She has been, by every account, a devoted mother in the month since James came home. I am choosing to let that matter. Gerald would have let it matter. I have seen the blanket in the crib, cream wool against a white fitted sheet, the blue sailboats along the border. I ran my thumb over the GM in the corner the first time I visited, just to make sure it was still there, though of course it was. I made it. I know how it holds. James will be 18 in 2043. In the spring of that year, when he opens a sealed envelope from a man he never met, he'll find 3 pages in handwriting that isn't mine. He'll read about the Cubs in Indiana in October and a summer when his grandfather was 22 and almost did something else. He'll read, "Be curious about everything. Be kind when it costs you. You come from people who tried." He'll have $47,000 in an account with his name on it, and if he runs his thumb along the border of an old cream blanket until he finds 2 small letters stitched in thread that matches the wool, GM, just big enough to feel, he'll know that someone who never held him loved him anyway, with everything he had left. That's what Gerald asked me to make. Not a blanket. That. My hands are what they are. They hurt in the mornings, and they slow me down, and some rows cost more than they should. But I finished what he asked. I finished it.